Okay, we're back with another Dragon Champions video. I'm going to be talking about the Elves faction with the release of Thalanne. I've been calling her Thalanne, maybe it's Thalanne, but Thalanne in a couple weeks. The Elves faction is going to be very interesting. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that they could see a huge resurgence in arena mode for sure, as just a pure speed DPS beatdown team. So let's go through the elves and what makes them potentially very strong. So most of you who've been playing the game know about Nightingale. For myself, will start gearing her very, very soon, especially because I have Soleus. But let's just look at her abilities and what makes her not even really, maybe arguably, but short of Shadar, who, unless you're in a doing the level 7 tier raids, you probably don't have. She's probably the best DPS in the game. So her basic attack is doing 240% magic damage and a 50% chance to deal shield piercing damage. There's going to be a lot of talk about shield piercing and penetration and how that scales up, but in layman's terms, if you're attacking somebody with a shield, you have to break down their shield first. But if you have a chance to penetrate through the shield because of the penetration offensive skill, which is used to calculate the damage dealt by abilities, reduces enemy physical and magic armor, you will kill them faster. Okay, so Veil of Silence, 420% magic damage to a single enemy. That is massive amounts of single target DPS. It also ability blocks them for 2 turns. So not only are you burst damaging this person, you are ability blocking them for good measure. Midnight Glow applies a damage increase to all allies for 2 turns. Huge buff. And with an elf-based team that I'm about to talk about, based purely on crit damage, I'm really, really excited about this. Her passive ability, when paired with Soleus, just makes her, I don't know, just overpowered in my opinion. I can see her getting nerfed at some point once a bunch of these teams come out, but hopefully not. Nightingale removes 1 debuff from herself and Soleus at the end of her turn. Removes 1 buff from a random enemy. If Soleus is on the battlefield, 2 buffs are removed instead. So you're removing debuffs from herself and Soleus, and at the same time removing buffs from the enemy. Lastly, her leadership ability increases the accuracy of all elves by 20%. If they land a crit, all elves recover 10% of their maximum health, and if they land a fatal blow, they recover 25% of their maximum health. So I may play around with this with the elf team, because the elf team I'm going to suggest is going to be without a healer from the elves faction. Next, we have Sharp. Sharp is a character you get near the beginning of the game. Single target DPS, useful for early game, but really when you get to mid to late game, very rarely used. But let's just look at his skill set. His basic is dealing 250%, not a lot. 50% chance to do armor decrease. His wombo combo is where he's used a lot, because it's doing 3 attacks to the enemy and each attack does 150% damage. Critical Thinking gains crit chance increase and applies it to all allies for 2 turns. Sharp also gains crit damage increase for 2 turns. So if you're somebody like myself that doesn't have some of the other characters like Wonder Loula unlocked or Count Delman, Sharp's probably going to be a placeholder for me as I build this crit team. Lastly, again talking about crit, his passive increases his crit chance by 30%. So if you are ruining him up with crit damage or crit chance runes, he's going to have a good chance to crit often. Right now I haven't really geared him up, and he still has a 30% chance to crit. You're looking at Illyria, again, one of the early game characters, where you have your basic healer. She will be your healer at the beginning of the game for a while with your order faction, but near mid-game she just becomes not as viable as the other healers that you're going to unlock. So her basic ability, dealing 190% and inflicts a potency decrease. Healing is an AoE heal of 350% of her magic damage. Her Star Orb is kind of a single target magic damage, 350%, which is a big amount, and she heals the ally with the lowest health by 50%. So this is one of her more useful abilities. And lastly, her magic damage increases by 25% and an additional 5% for each elf in the party living elf. So, you combine certain percentages of magic damage stacking, then it leads to bigger heals. But like I said, it's not a healer that you normally will be using at all mid to end game. Senjil. Struggle with him is that most players have Illyria. They're already leveling her up to probably 50. And so by that time, you're wondering, why do I need 2 healers to get me through this game, especially 2 that aren't exactly strong. So Senjil himself deals 190% magic damage and inflicts burning. If you want to make a burning poison style team, it's one of my guildmates was talking about, he'd be a character you'd probably have to include. But really, when you're looking at content in the game, if you're doing arena or raids, you don't have much time to be building burning stacks. Regen is probably his most useful ability. He applies 2 stacks of regens to 3 allies with the lowest health. If you fight Senjil teams in tower or events, campaign mode, you'll see that anybody has a regen stack. Just you almost just don't bother, let them regen and have that buff wear off, and then work at them again. So regen, kind of an annoying. This equally annoying, single target heal of 500%, which is really good, and the regen for 4 turns. The reason why I don't say it's as useful is, again, if you're in arena mode, you just ignore the guy with 4 stacks of regen. You pick everybody else away. Same thing in tower. So it's great on paper, but in reality, you're probably not going to be using that much. And lastly is passive. 10% increase in magic damage for each stack of regen on allies. So again, you're just building off your regen. Interesting mechanic, but for today, just not really viable. Calum, an underrated tank. He has decent abilities. So basic 180% physical damage to an enemy. If the target has the lowest health, they're guaranteed to land a crit. His taunt is a 2-turn taunt, and it also removes debuffs and recovers 25% health. He does have an AoE attack, which is 190%, but inflicts armor decrease, which would come in handy if you're building a crit team. And lastly, his passive increases magic armor by 25% and an additional 5% for each living elf in the party. I have seen his survivability be pretty good at higher levels. And again, as somebody that is building an elf team, he'd be a placeholder for me while I'm getting the other DPS characters, and somebody I will swap out later. Fay Lea, rarely ever see her get used, and you'll see why. Just there's so many other characters that have much better ability kits. she just seems lost in the mix. So her basic deals 180% to an enemy, deals an additional 20% for each deck of regen. So you almost have to pair her with like a Senjil. And like I said, if you're not using Senjil, why are you using Fay Lea? Poison Vine, you are dealing magic damage to an enemy, then chaining, but then the damage is halved for each new enemy struck. It does inflict poison, but then 50% to poison. It's too random number generator for me for such an attack. She does have an AoE. 230% is not a lot. It does inflict damage decrease, but again, here's now inflict slow on goblin enemies for 2 turns. If this just said inflict slow on all enemies, I would see a massive uptick in her usage and popularity. But right now, you're relying on facing a goblin team. Lastly, her passive, again, you're relying on, okay, increased magic damage to 20%. If Illyria is an ally, if Senji is an ally, you have different buffs. But now you're forced into having 2 mediocre to terrible healers on your team and a mediocre to terrible, in my opinion, character. So now let's get to the exciting stuff. Here's Count Delman. Currently the Battle Pass character of the month, and he is quite awesome for basically your DPS team. So his basic already 270% damage and a 70% chance to increase the cooldown of a random ability for 1 turn. So you are delaying the enemy's attacks and abilities. 380% physical damage to an enemy and inflicts what we call this Mark of Death for 3 turns. This is allowing you to attack them as if they had taunt, and they also block them from having invisibility and increases the damage inflicted on the target by 15%. As an ex-World of Warcraft player, this is a classic mark, hunter's mark, that maybe you'd put on an opponent. So I'm just reminiscing right now. But if you think about this, you are dealing with an arena team and you're stuck behind a taunt. Now you Mark of Death the character you actually want to attack, let's just say a Solius, and not only can they not be invisible, so Kyra gets nullified there, and Wonder Loula's ability gets nullified. Now you also increase the damage dealt to that target, so you're going to burn them down faster. Really like that. His third ability gains dodge increase for 2 turns and recovers turn meter, and all allies gain crit damage increase. So on a crit team, this is a really nice buff. Lastly, his passive ability, he gains 500 penetration. As I said earlier in the video, you are now going to break through shields and armor. If Thalanne is an ally, both of them get an increase in physical damage. If Wonder Loula is an ally, they increase their crit chance. So where I'm going to get with this is building a team with Count Delman, Thalanne, Wonder Loula, you automatically now just buff their crit chance and crit damage. So speaking of Wonder Loula, originally when she came out, she was much more popular. They did nerf her down. She's your traditional glass cannon, meaning she has low health but high burst ability. Somebody that I will focus on unlocking very soon. So her basic does 180%, but if they have more health than Loula, which is in most cases because she has low health all the time, it deals 225% instead. It also deals 50% more crit damage. Piercing shot, 300% damage to an enemy, half the damage penetrates their shield. Also guaranteed to deal a crit if she's invisible. Well, how does she become invisible? She gains invisibility through her own ability and applies it to all allied healers, tacticians, and fighters for 2 turns. So who's a fighter other than herself? Count Delman, Fay Lea, healers, Sendi, Illyria, Sharp, and of course Nighteel. So basically your whole elf team is going to go invisible. Really like that ability. And lastly, her passive increases her physical damage by 20%. Additional 7% for each living demon in the enemy's party. Again, you know what my thoughts are on faction-specific buffs. I don't really like that. But as you see more and more demon teams come out, then as Shadar gets released, I'm sure this will come in handy as kind of their counter. Okay, so lastly, Thalanne. So she's the focus of the event coming, and she is also an awesome character. 250% as a basic and dazes the enemy. Why is the debuff important? Because one of her other abilities is based on debuffs. 440% single target damage. So when I talked about Nighteel earlier and kind of marveled at her single target damage, 420% with ability block, similarly, you're looking at the same thing from Thalanne with 440%. So it inflicts the heal block and buff immunity. She also has an AoE while she's at it, and ability blocks them if all enemies receive damage. Only 270% though. Her passive, this is what I was talking about with the debuffs. Debuffing an enemy increases her turn meter by 20% and an additional 4% for each debuff applied. That is huge, especially if she can land the AoE debuff. And lastly, her leadership, which I would probably be using instead of Nighteel, is increasing the crit chance of all allied elves by 30%, recovers their turn meter by 10 when they land a crit, and a 50% chance to restore one turn. So without further ado, here's the team that I will be building. It's going to be a crit team: Nighteel, Count Delman, Wonder Loula, Thalanne, and Soleus, with Thalanne as the lead potentially. Basically, there's your healer. You go tankless, go into arena, and just try to burst them down fast. I'm going to try this out and see how it goes. So again, if you stuck around, thanks. I know it's a long video, but that's kind of my review of the elf faction. Previously very weak, but with the abilities or introduction of Count Delman, and now the ability to get Thalanne, I highly anticipate you see many elf teams with Soleus in the future. So if you like this video, please give me a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be back with another Dragon Champions video soon. Thanks.